Now to a morning must-read for you. Bloomberg editor-in-chief John Micklethwaite sat down with Christine Lagarde, IMF managing director, for the cover story of Bloomberg Markets. In response to correcting crisis, she said, quote, "It's usually when something goes through a massive crisis, an existential one, that eventually it bounces out of it and onto a new plateau." Joining us now is Bloomberg editor-in-chief John Micklethwaite. John, the tone seems to be that things could be fixed and they could be fixed quite easily, but they're not being fixed because we're not at crisis mode.
If only there was a crisis. Or it's a very strange thing. You have this organisation which is there to deal with the things after the crisis, and yet usually the only way they can get people to do the things that might prevent the next crisis is almost to drive the things off the edge. It's like it's back to Matt Miller's, one of Matt Miller's cars. You have to go right the way to the edge of the precipice, nearly go over, and then maybe it gets a bit better.
This, as we hear, the IMF might actually lower its forecast and so forth. So how does she intend to sort of simulate a crisis, if you like?
I think even that. I think the problem for her is that the world is quite good at simulating crises even without her. So she sits there and these things come towards her. And I think really the euro crisis, I suspect, is the one which is imprinted on her brain, because she had that right from the beginning. She was France's finance minister. And throughout that entire history of that crisis, it's always the thing where it goes all the way through, and at the last moment it doesn't. Just comes back and they kick the can down the road again, but they never quite solve things. And so she sat there watching this for a long, long time.
One of the things that I took away from your interview is you had a fairly detailed discussion with her about the sort of reforms she would like if there were a crisis. She took you through what she'd really like to see done.
She would like to have seen all the things to do with capital and banks sorted out much more quickly. She's intrigued, I think, by the way that some places, Saudi Arabia, some places are looking at consolidation, but she's moved the IMF generally away from being this sort of famous tough doctor. I think they've learnt a bit from Greece. In Greece, they imposed these incredibly hard conditions, and the economy shrank so much that actually it caused more trouble than it was worth.
And she basically admitted that was a mistake.
Yes.
In your interview.
Very clearly. I think to be fair to them, they've gone back through that before a few times, but it's been a very difficult time. And she talks a bit about this idea of fiscal space, that people should have fiscal space to do things, and that by itself I think is quite revolutionary. Because back in the old days of the IMF, you used to meet these people who would have said, look, there's only fiscal. Whenever you think about fiscal space, it's only going to be there until it's gone. They would question all that.
But it feels like all she has to do is open her eyes and there's a crisis. We have the migrant crisis, we have Greece back in crisis, there's a crisis in Latin America in several different countries. Is sub 1% US GDP not a crisis?
Yes, I think she looks, and her view of the world is, wouldn't it, really it's beginning to get better. But as you say, you look right the way around the world and all you see is more of these crises coming towards you. And some of them you get the impression that she just desperately wishes the politicians would act. It's a repetitive theme on this programme, but really wishes that the politicians would actually solve things, that they take it all the way through. Rather than just patching up the euro crisis, they do something with it. You look at places like Brazil, those big emerging markets, they had these opportunities to do reforms and they didn't.
John, trading floors on Wall Street, on the City of London, if you're up late in Asia and you tune into Bloomberg Go, a cynical bunch that say, why does Lagarde and whatever she thinks mean anything to me? And when the IMF come out with a growth forecast later this week, why should that mean anything to me? They're constantly behind the curve. What is the IMF's role at the moment, John?
They are the lender of last resort to the lenders of last resort. If your central bank gets in trouble, and you think of all the hours every trading floor now spends obsessing about central banks, somewhere behind that is the IMF. The IMF is the firefighter in the end, and if things get into trouble, you have to rely on them. You look at Greece, you look at the other markets, you're probably going to have to look at a lot of emerging markets, and she will be there. So she remains a very, very important person. I know exactly what you mean, is that markets...
I know a few of those guys,
They kind of groan when they hear the words IMF, but it's there.
So, John, I want to take us back to what you referred to, banks and reserve requirements. One of the things I found fascinating in what Christine Lagarde said to you was she sees the increased capital requirements as being a way of severing the tie between sovereigns and banks, so they don't have to jump in. But at the same time, she expressed some reservation about how fast the banks have moved to reform. In fact, I'm going to quote now from your interview. In banks, it's taken longer than it could have, and I think that's partly due to the financial sector players themselves and their reluctance, for instance, to increase capital, particularly to have core Tier 1 capital right from the get-go.
I think that's true. You look at what's happened in America, America on the whole, banks agreed to these things quicker. They did a lot of lobbying, but they got the thing through. In Europe, the banks have been part of that endlessly slow process about trying to do reforms. So what's happened in Europe is that the banks fundamentally have not gone through the same degree of writing off loans, doing the things that the Americans have done. But I think even in America, you could make the case that Wall Street went and lobbied very, very, very hard, and that has slowed down the whole process. And her point is that slightly, yes, that may have meant slightly better rules for the banks than they started with, but overall, it's meant a system which has taken longer to adjust.